Well, welcome to everyone for this session, in a very interesting session about Caribbean slave owners. This time, we're welcoming Dr. Michael O'Connor, who'll be talking about his new book and telling us about the links that Ireland has with slave ownership and other histories of the time. And we're delighted, particularly because we've not been able to welcome a colleague from Ireland before, and I've asked especially that Michael's going to tell us a little bit about Irish history, just for those of us who aren't too confident that we know much about Irish history. So we're just going to start. I'm Liz Millman from Learning Links International, and I've got my colleagues Simon from Belong Nottingham, who's doing the technical things, and David Alston from Matine, Scotland. He's also the author of a book, Slaves and Highlanders. And we started this season's sessions with a very interesting presentation that David gave us about his newly published book. So all our information is now on www.blackhistoryconversations.com. I'm actually in Australia, and so it's customary and respectful to recognise the traditional owners on the land on which I'm currently living, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, recognising their elders, past, present and future, as this land belongs to the sovereign peoples of the First Nations and was never ceded. It always was, always will be, the land of the First Nations people. And we've got the Aboriginal flag and the Torres Straits Islanders flag there on the slide. You'll also see the lady standing on the left. She was doing the welcome to country. This is what this is called. But I can't do a welcome to country, I can only acknowledge. But people with Aboriginal heritage can do welcome to country. And she was doing that at a Zoom session I was watching last night, so I kept that clip. But also to show you some of the extent of the damage that we experienced in storms in the Mount Dandenong National Park just 6 months ago. And this is still affecting us very badly. However, we were very fortunate, nobody was killed, so but 70 people were homeless, including my family. So I'm in rented accommodation at the moment, but that's fine. Okay, so we're going to now ask Dr. Michael O'Connor to take over. I'll stop sharing and you'll be able to start sharing. But just to say that on the PowerPoint that I'll be posting on the website, there's a direct link here to be able to purchase the book, or there's an excellent article from the Mayo News, so that's going to be helpful, I think. And there's also going to be a very short summary that this is included in the presentation for those of you who need to brush up on your Irish history, so that helped me. So I'll just stop screen sharing and hand over to you then, Michael.
Thank you, Liz, for that and for the introduction. I'm just going to share the slides. There we go. Okay, there we go. First of all, I want to say I'm really excited to actually be in this forum today. I've been talking about this book through October and November to an incredibly different audience, unimaginably different audience to the people that I have the pleasure of talking to today. I've been talking around Mayo, around Ireland, doing a little bit online as well. And I'm talking to an audience that is, for the most part, unaware of this aspect of our history. And those that are aware are have a very different understanding of it. Some of that, I suppose, lack of understanding is based on misinformation, or is based on narratives that have been put out there over time that tell a very different story about this aspect of our history and about the people who participated in it. So I think, so for me today is not just an opportunity, it's also something that I've been looking forward to. My book and my approach to all of this, I'm a lawyer by background, I've had a passion for history for, since as long as I can possibly remember, and passion for the history of Ireland, but also specifically the history of Mayo. Mayo is a remote place, and you find that there are some wonderful academic books written on all aspects of the history of Ireland. The academics writing them tend to draw completely legitimately from examples from other parts of Ireland. And for whether by accident or by design, and I think it's by accident, Mayo just gets left out. So it's almost as if we, it's as if we didn't exist. We do get there in terms of some of the big stuff, the French invasion or rebellion of 1798, the famine and things like that, because they were big and they were significant in the county itself. But for the most part, other stuff, we are part of the audience. We make up the statistics and the numbers, rather than being the people who are front and central. The second thing I try to do is I try to publish uncomfortable histories, things that people have a difficulty with, have an issue with, feel uncomfortable about. So I go into institutions and I look at the women who are in those institutions. I go into memorials. I look at who's on the memorials and ask questions why and all of that. And this book is really about that kind of thing. It's essentially a collection of histories. There's 20 of them in total. And in the time available, and also to accommodate Liz's request that I talk about Irish history, it would be ambitious in the extreme to seek to work through all of these histories. So I'm not obviously going to do that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about some of the principal themes that underpin the histories, themes of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. And these themes are explored to the lives and experiences of people, including enslaved people, planter slavers, colonial soldiers, Irish tenant farmers, colonial administrators, etc. And the reason I do this is that my fascination is not title, uniform, rank, or that kind of thing. My fascination is ordinary people. And I like telling the stories of ordinary people. I like going into the homes and minds of ordinary people and talking about them and seeing how they fared in this great big world of empire and colonialism and all of those things. The common denominator for all these people, be they in Jamaica, many of them are, or in the other islands of the Caribbean, or in Sri Lanka, or in Ceylon as it was, or in Ireland, common denominator is, in one way or another, they all have a connection with the place I'm from, County Mayo. So the book was launched here in Murrisk, the west of Ireland, small fishing village, a really beautiful place, in October. And I believe that it was a fitting place to launch the book, or to launch a book that includes a history of the links between my part of the world, or this part of the world, and the historic slave plantations of the Caribbean. At least 5 and possibly more families from the Clew Bay area, well, you'll see what that is in a moment, owned estates in the British West Indies, where Africans and their descendants were enslaved over many generations. At least 15 families with a Mayo connection were involved in slavery in the period 1670 to 1834. And there are other families that I am currently working on, and I do allude to them in passing in the book. So the book itself, of the 20 stories, the backbone of it is really two histories. One that deals with these individuals and families from County Mayo who made their way to the Caribbean and became involved in planting and in the enslavement of peoples, and also individuals who, Irish people who joined the regiments of the British Army and traveled the empire, soldiering for the empire, into the Caribbean, but in other places as well. So these planter slavers who came from Mayo gave or forced those they enslaved to take their West of Ireland names. So today, names such as Garvey, Burke, Brown, Cuff, Gibbons, and Clark are carried by descendants of those enslaved before the abolition of slavery in the empire in 1834. In 1922, Jamaican political activist and black nationalist Marcus Garvey stated, and I really like this, "An Irish slave master gave my forebear the name Garvey. He, the forebear, was not allowed to pass on to us his African name, but by the God of my fathers, the living and true God, the name Garvey will plague white oppressors until all Africa is free."
Michael, can I just ask you,
Yep.
Are you moving the slides through?
Yeah, I know. I'll get to the slides in about 1 minute.
Okay, that's okay. That's fine.
All right. So Garvey's ancestors were enslaved in Jamaica. He believed his surname came from the west of Ireland, as do I. And Marcus Garvey was a vocal supporter of the Irish struggle for independence from Britain. And that's really important in Ireland at the moment, because we've just gone through a year of commemoration of the emergence of what was then called the Irish Free State from the United Kingdom. So our own home here in Murrisk was built on land owned by a family who had a long succession or association with slavery in Jamaica. So in about 1700, Captain Christopher Garvey left Ireland and his estate in the barony of Murrisk to pursue wealth and prosperity in the Caribbean. And just before abolition, we find his descendants owned at least 3 plantations in Jamaica. And these plantations and plantations owned by other planter slavers with a Mayo connection were given idyllic names such as Orange Hall, Cocoa Walk, Harmony Hall, and Rosemont. But these places, or these plantations, were not, as we all know, places of peace and tranquility. They were places where men, women, and children were beaten, flogged, bought, sold, mortgaged, and bequeathed in wills. We have runaway slave Edward O'Connor, a Creole. He reveals that he was on the run for 8 years from Lord Sligo when he was captured. In a history titled Caribbean Slave Owners, I look in detail at the families with a Mayo connection who enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, the reasons for their migration into the Caribbean, those they enslaved, and the issue of legacy. So many of those who enslaved people in the Caribbean also held vast estates in County Mayo and in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I certainly didn't know that the 18th and 19th century landlords in the place where I grew up, a place called Belcarra, that the landlords there, the Cuff family of Ballinrobe, were also planters and slavers in the Caribbean. And we see the income from these slave plantations and rent receipts from tenants at home funding a lifestyle and life experience that was utterly alien to the tenants in Ireland and the enslaved people in the Caribbean. So in 1832, we have one prolific writer in the Connaught Telegraph in Ireland, in Mayo. He hounded Lord Sligo for the treatment of his white slaves in Mayo. Sligo's tenants were, it was alleged, treated worse than his slaves in Jamaica. And now, almost 200 years later, the belief that tenants on Irish landed estates were treated worse than enslaved Africans endures, and was repeatedly raised during the summer of 2020 in online media debates and in other forums in Ireland. Sligo's tenants suffered appalling degradation. Their terrible life experiences were not comparable in terms of scale and brutality to those enslaved by Sligo and the many others of his class on plantations in the Caribbean. Sligo owned vast estates in Mayo, but in Jamaica he owned the land and the people. For the first time in a Mayo context, I introduce some of those enslaved by Sligo and the many others. And if the colonial slave registers tell us anything, it is that Sligo and others not only stole the lives of those they enslaved, they also stole their identity and ethnicity. It is genuinely shocking as a person from Mayo to look at lists of enslaved persons with given names that mirror names of people and places in Mayo. Names like Dennis Brown, Sally Brown, John Gibbons, and places like Castlebar and the town of Westport. So, sorry, this image, I just want to say just something quickly about it, sorry. Back up. This image here is Castle Burke. And Castle Burke, the ruin lies on the shores of Lough Carra in County Mayo. And Castle Burke is an Anglo-Norman castle. The Burke family were Anglo-Normans who came to Ireland, and they dominated, I suppose, the politics of Mayo for quite some time. And what's interesting is that we find in 50s, 1660s, and 70s, we have a planter slaver in St. Croix in the Caribbean, whose plantation is called Estate Castle Burke. And so the estate takes the name from this ancestral seat in County Mayo. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So this essentially is my back garden, the top 3 images. On the left top, we have a mountain, which actually is a lot higher than it looks in the photograph, called Croix Patrick. And it's been a place of pilgrimage going back to the time of St. Patrick. And before that, a very long pagan tradition. Now, this place is full of history and archaeology, which I'm obviously not going to talk about now. But this was Captain Christopher Garvey's land. It was his estate. And in the center, we have an Augustinian friary built in 1456. and now in ruins, but the graveyard is still used. And the history of Ireland and the history of the empire is memorialized on the walls of this abbey and in the graveyard. So we have memorials and tombs for World War I, World War II, colonial soldiers abroad, colonial soldiers in Africa, colonial administrators. We have the clergy of several different faiths. We have a multitude of ordinary Irish people, people from the islands off the coast. And we even have the grave of one colonial soldier, English soldier, who found himself, for family reasons, in the Murrisk area. And at abolition, he is submitting a claim for compensation for the loss of enslaved persons in Jamaica that he received or he inherited in the will of an ancestor. So this abbey is a very important, I suppose, statement or a very important memorial in its entirety of the history of colonialism and empire. The memorial on the right is a more recent one, dates to the 1990s. This is our famine, National Famine Memorial, and it's a very large memorial. It takes the form of what we call a coffin ship, and coffin ships were ships that departed the ports of Ireland during the famine of 1845 to 1852. During this period, 1 million people died. At least 1 million people left, were forced to leave. And these ships were making for the North Atlantic, for Newfoundland, Quebec, places like that. And because the ships were massively overcrowded, because the people suffered from disease and illness, and because the ships were fundamentally not seaworthy, a lot of these ships were lost in the North Atlantic and thousands died in them. So again, this ship makes up this whole suite of, I suppose, memory and commemoration in this little place on the West Coast. Down at the bottom left, we've got an image from a newspaper. It's not a very good one. And it is the Garvey Lodge, Murrisk Lodge. It was demolished some years ago. But the Garveys remained on in Murrisk after 1700, right into the 20th century. And at one point in time, their lands were acquired by the state, and the land is divided amongst the tenant farmers who had farmed it for many generations. So that's a little look at where I am. This is Marcus Garvey, and this year I've been making much of the connection between Marcus Garvey and our part of the world, not just in the context of my book, but also in the context of this connection we have with him and his interest in the freedom of the Irish people in the 20th century. This, I'm going to look at very briefly, is obviously a map of Ireland. Those of you who are not that familiar with the detail of it, the left-hand side is the west and towards the Atlantic. So looking straight across at, the North American continent, Newfoundland, etc. This is Mayo here, one of the largest counties by landmass, but not by population. The population has fallen from close to 400,000 before the famine to about 130,000 in 2016. So a massive population decline. Up here on the top right-hand corner, we've got the 6 counties of Ireland that elected to remain part of the United Kingdom. And then we've got the border shown in red that is the partition of the island of Ireland. And then there are 26 counties make up the balance in the on the southern side of the border. So Liz has asked me to say a few words about the colonization of Ireland. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one example because this is an enormous topic. And I'm also not a scholar of the colonization of Ireland. So I'm going to pick the Cromwellian invasion. I mean, overall, the colonization of Ireland was, secured with ruthless efficiency and disregard for human life over a very prolonged period. So in August 1849, we have Cromwell arriving in Ireland with 12,000 troops, with some sophisticated siege equipment, lots of guns and cannon, and essentially he defeats all the opposition that comes up against him. He pursues a scorched earth policy, and this results in famine and disease and a lot of deaths from that, as well as the conflict. And we have massacres at Drogheda, which is a town north of Dublin, and down the southeast of Wexford. And now the numbers for those who died during the Cromwellian and as a result of the Cromwellian invasion are highly contested. And so I'm putting that 25% up there with a caveat. And I've seen other percentages that are much higher. And I've seen percentages shown over different time frames. so more of the 1840s into the 1860s. So it is difficult to get any understanding of the number. But what I like to say, I suppose, is the number was significant in any case. So the lands of Catholic landowners lost their lands. The lands were given to Cromwellian adventurers and to Cromwellian soldiers in return for as payment. And from this, this possession of the Catholic landowners and the movement of them, or the forced movement of them, to the poorer lands in the west of Ireland, to Connacht and to Mayo, we get the phrase to hell or to Connacht. So essentially, Cromwell gives Ireland a clean slate. Sorry, gives England a clean slate in Ireland, and so one of the things that I like to stress when I'm talking about this is part of something that I try my best to get out there, and that is that the history of Ireland is really, really complex. And if you approach the history of Ireland on Irish versus English, Protestant versus Catholic, you really get into a quagmire very quickly. And these areas that I'm talking about, slavery and military regiments and all that, it becomes very complex if you take that kind of a black and white simplistic approach to it. It was much more complicated. So when you look at the Cromwellian invasion, Cromwell was opposed not only by the Catholic Irish families, chieftains, whatever you call them, but he was also opposed by the Anglo-Normans Catholics in Ireland. So these are the families who had come to Ireland, a few hundred years earlier, settled in, intermarried with the Irish, settled down, and were said to have become more Irish than the Irish themselves. So Cromwell, they had an allegiance to the crown in England, and Cromwell was also their enemy. So you see this alignment of interest to deal with this common foe. So following the invasion and the wars, you see a lot of people get transported to Barbados. Again, the numbers here really contentious, and a lot is made of this transportation of Irish people to Barbados. But in the scheme of things, and the scheme of what happens in the Caribbean more generally, this is a very small episode. So I've stolen this map from Trinity College Dublin. This is the Down Survey project, and this is a fascinating project being run by Trinity, and it's online, and the link to the website is there. And essentially it just shows the impact of this Cromwellian invasion and the settlement of land afterwards. And you see you've got 4 categories and different colors, and so you've got this navy color counties reserved for the adventurers and army. So this is a strip of land that runs from the northeast of Ireland down through the fertile counties in the centre. So North Leinster, Meath, and down into North Munster. Then you've got the counties reserved for government. So this is the traditional seat of government on the east side, so around Dublin and down to North Leinster, what was historically known as the Pale, or some of that was the Pale, and then down the south, Cork. And then we have some more additional counties to be provided for the army. So that's the balance of Ulster, down into North Connacht, so Sligo, and down in County Kerry on the southwest coast. And then finally, we've got the counties assigned to transplanted Catholics. And so this encompasses Mayo. And beneath Mayo, we've got Galway, and beneath that again, County Clare. So essentially, the poor land, the boggy land, the wet land, and the stony land, the burren of County Clare. So, as I say, Mayo is set aside for this Catholics. And then after Cromwellian invasion, then we've got Williamite war after that. You see this migration out of Ireland to the Caribbean. And this migration is predominantly Anglo-Irish families who have, for one reason or another, lost out as a consequence of all the turmoil. And so you see the Blake family of Galway and Mayo. Now, the Blakes are a really important source because their letterbook, their letters going between Barbados, Montserrat, Ireland, and London, an extensive number of personal letters have survived. And these are incredible sources for commerce, for personal family matters, for dealing with debt, commerce, all of these things, and of course, enslavement and the commerce of slavery. And these letters are online and can be found. So I focus quite a bit on them in the book. So we have 3 brothers from the Blake family, Henry, John, and another Nicholas, going to Montserrat and Barbados, acquiring sugar plantations, enslaved labor, and really making it good, getting enough to acquire or purchase back what they've lost in Ireland. And also one of them remains behind and becomes part of the colonial setup in Montserrat. The Garvey family of Murrisk I've talked about, they go to Jamaica, and then a number of Burke families spread out across the Caribbean, but principally in Jamaica, but also in St. Croix, Antigua, and other places. So it would be a mistake to say that all of this migration was linked to the significant events in Irish history. I mean, certainly, to a large extent it was, but there were also family and commercial connections, people who had gone before. And so we see, for example, the Blake's decision to go to Barbados and Montserrat. We know why they're going. They're going because they want to rebuild, but it's easy for them to go because the family have a long tradition and history in commerce on the Atlantic and trading with Britain. So they've got a framework that they can work with. Marriage also brings these families into the Caribbean, and the principal example of this is the Brown family of Westport. So we see in the middle of the 1850s, 1860s, sorry, 1750s, 1760s, we see a marriage between the Browns of Westport and the Kellys of Galway. And the Kellys have two plantations in Jamaica, which fall into the Brown ownership through marriage. And 3 generations later at abolition, we see how Peter Brown lines up for compensation for the loss of the 286 people he had enslaved at that time. Change of fortune in a more general sense, as opposed to change of fortune arising from conflict, was also a reason, as was lack of opportunity in Ireland. So a lot of these families had a lot of children. So you see the eldest sons being the heir apparent, other sons going into the military, the church, professions, but others make their way to the Caribbean and involve themselves in plantations. So principally, Anglo-Irish families and individuals, the upper tier of society, landed class landlords. Now, I've put the word principally there, and I have fought this tooth and nail for 2 years, and the battle, I believe, will never be won, but it's a battle that really does deserve to be fought. There is a very strong view in Ireland that those revealed by the legacies of slave ownership database who did get involved in slavery in the Caribbean were not Irish people. And when you work it through with people, they insist that they were not Catholic. They were. They insist that if they were Catholic, they weren't Irish, they were English. Yes, they were English, but they were Irish Catholics. And ultimately they take the line is taken that these people were just traitors. They weren't Irish people. But I have found enough, or more than enough, Irish names of families that would be considered to be Irish families in that sense, including O'Connors, O'Flaherty's, O'Briens, Malones, etc., who were involved in slavery in the Caribbean. But from a Mayo perspective, it is principally Anglo-Irish families. And I've put a list of the Mayo names there at the bottom. There are others. I mean, one family that I am looking at the moment is the O'Malley family, who had a plantation known as Newport Lodge. So these plantations, you can look at it at different points in time. You can look at it as abolition because of the legacies of British slave ownership database enables you to get a picture at that time. But that gives you a very distorted picture because it's a moment in time. It's numbers based on what people were putting forward to gain compensation. But if you work your way back through the colonial slave registers and all the myriad of other sources, you get to build up a much clearer picture of those who were involved in slavery and the numbers and the individuals enslaved. So this income from the Caribbean allows these individuals connected with Mayo to acquire titles and estates and find houses, build political dynasties, and this is particularly so of the Brown family of Westport. They educate their children. It allows them to engage in social pursuits, horse racing, travel, etc. And it is really clear from looking at their personal records and documents and other records that these Mayo Irish planters were no less brutal in the treatment of the enslaved people than others. And the pattern from Mayo is not dissimilar to most of the other counties across Ireland. I've just created this map. I'm not going to dwell on it, but over here you can sort of see, you can see Clew Bay, and you can see the different families that around the bay, ranging from Newport, the Gibbons family, all the way over here on the west side to the Clark family of Newport. And I'll be adding to this over time, and this kind of ties in with the narrative for each of these families in the book itself. This is just a extract from the Jamaican map that shows Lord Mayo. This is John Burke, 8th Viscount Mayo. So he, through marriage, acquires a plantation in St. John's Parish in the mid 18th century. He holds on to it till his death, and then his wife marries another planter slaver from Mayo, Edmund Jordan, who then in turn holds on to it until just after the turn of the century, when it is sold. St. Croix, now the map, it's not possible to see the estate Castle Burke, but it's in here in the south central region, and it's clearly marked as estate Castle Burke. One of the things that's really interesting about St. Croix is that at this time, and we're talking 1754, the map, so we're talking 1750s, 1760s, 1770s, there's a Dominican settlement on St. Croix. And this Dominican settlement is, the Christian brothers there are from Ireland, and as one of them is from County Mayo. And what's really great is that their correspondence with the Vatican has survived, and there's quite a body of it. And it's, it reveals all sorts of things about, establishing this colony, this mission on a frontier, and all the challenges of that, their interaction with the planters, what they thought of the planters. There's a lot of stuff on, religious issues to do with the enslaved population, planters themselves. But what is interesting is that these Christian brothers, whilst it is almost certainly clear that they don't own enslaved persons themselves, they clearly have access to the enslaved population through their relationship with the planters themselves. And sorry, the final one then put up is just an image I grabbed very recently, and this is Montserrat, and it just shows that today, it just shows or indicates the connection between the Blakes and Montserrat, dating back all the way back to the 1670s up to 1700 or maybe beyond. So we've got the Blake's Road and Blake's Estate. So I want to just dwell for a little bit, and this again I suppose is from Liz asking me to look at this. I just want to dwell a little bit on this idea of the Irish being an inferior culture. And so I've just set out there, just from contemporary writings, some of the things that were said about the Irish population. Now, I would say that the top two in particular have been subject to a lot of academic scrutiny and a lot of debate and interpretation. So I don't want to be putting these up here and saying this was said about the Irish population without also acknowledging that there is an element of them being contested as well. So we have Edmund Spenser, spends a lot of time in Ireland, the poet, and refers to the Irish people as the most barbarous nation in Christendom. We have, and I would imagine that Edmund Spenser also included in that the Anglo-Normans who had settled into Ireland and become more Irish than the Irish themselves. Then we've got Oliver Cromwell after the massacre at Drogheda in a letter saying that I am persuaded this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches, etc. The one that probably gets most debate in Ireland is that of Charles Trevelyan, the Victorian civil servant who's tasked with distribution of relief during the Great Famine in Ireland. Now, Trevelyan is seen as being, one of the great enemies of Ireland. And if you're familiar with the fields of Athenry, and if you listen to that song, you'll hear that Trevelyan does undoubtedly get a mention. So Trevelyan, the issue for Trevelyan is that he's tasked with giving out aid, but he really sees the fault for this famine lying with the Irish people themselves. He sees it as being the judgment of God, and that really we need to be measured in how we respond to this, and that we really need to allow this idea of laissez-faire economics to prevail. The market responds, and we just see how we get on. So for that reason, and also those that would seek to peddle the notion, and I'm not one of them, that the famine in Ireland was genocide. would rely very heavily on the writings of Charles Trevelyan. So during the famine, we have, now this is the famine of 1830s, and I just put that up to illustrate the point that there are many famines in Ireland. It's not just the Great Famine. So in 1830, and this is a period that's of particular interest to me for a number of other reasons, we have this radical MP with, who's supportive of the Irish tenants, basically noting that the landlords in County Mayo at that time, so the Binghams, the Browns, etc., saw and treated the people of Mayo not as human beings, but as inferior creatures. And during this time, in the 1830s, we've got the rise of new police force in Ireland, and we have a lot of extrajudicial killing of civilians. And this is something that I've worked hard to bring to the attention of people here, and it's kind of one of our really histories that really is hidden and unknown. And these killings were very much of unarmed civilians in different contexts. And in all cases, they were inquests, and all of the decisions or all the findings of the juries was that all these individuals, despite being unarmed, despite not being combatants in any sense of the word, were killed because the military or mostly the constabulary, rather the military, were in fear of their own lives. So the military or the constabulary don't give evidence. There's no accountability. There's no redress, and this breeds a terrible sentiment of resentment against the police force, which is not actually based on the killings themselves, I believe, but more on the response or lack of response to them. I also want to mention briefly the penal laws. So this is a very comprehensive code of legislation brought in from 1695 that endures for approximately a century. And this code prohibits Catholics from marrying Protestants and vice versa. It excludes Catholics from education, from public office, from the professions, from the military, prohibits them from owning firearms, and a whole range of other things. This, according to one commentator, Burns, he likens it to this legislation is persistent, and it's directed at changing a people. And I think those words are both important and both true when you look at and delve into the detail of the legislation. And for anybody who wants to do that, there's an excellent page on the University of Michigan website where they've taken this legislation and put it up, easy access with some really good summaries. Edmund Burke described the laws as well fitted for the oppression, impoverishment, and degradation of a people as ever proceeded from the perverted ingenuity of man. So in Mayo in the early 18th century, we see priest hunters in the countryside with yeomanry and in some cases the military hunting priests. Now in Ireland there's a myth that these priests were hunted for the purpose of killing them, and I've been working quite hard to dispel this myth. The law did not prescribe the killing of priests. It's prescribed their banishment, their registration and banishment to the continent. Now if they returned, which many of them of course did, they were then guilty of treason and could be hung for treason. But we have Robert Miller of Milford going around the countryside with others and rounding up priests and having them sent to, and he's working for Dublin Castle, having them sent to ports where they are transported. Now we had in 2013 a little movie made about the Millers of Milford, and it's a wonderfully poignant and interesting movie about the demise of the Anglo-Irish class in Ireland following independence in 1922. So a lot of these people, either by choice or because they felt they didn't belong anymore, leave Ireland, sell their properties and go to England. The Millers were not amongst those. They are there and they remain there today. But in the context of this movie, we have the director of the movie makes a statement that the exodus of this Anglo-Irish class from Ireland post-independence should be likened or could be likened to a polite form of ethnic cleansing. And I take significant issue with that from the descendant of somebody whose ancestor was a Cromwellian soldier who was involved in some pretty despicable stuff a few hundred years ago. So there are long memories in Ireland and in Mayo. So if Catholics were excluded from all the good stuff and education, what were they doing? Well, the vast majority of them were tenant farmers and laborers. They farmed very small farms, and then sitting on top of them, there was either a landlord or a series of middlemen who were, in many instances, worse than the ultimate landlord. And these farms, because families grew, these farms were divided over and over again so they get smaller, less viable, and the sole or almost exclusive crop was the potato. And people in coastal communities had some access to herring and fish, and there's certainly evidence of buttermilk and some meat as well. But potato really was the core staple food. Then something happens in 1793, which is quite interesting, and this is part of the relaxation of the penal laws. We have the laws changed, and Catholics are allowed to join the British Army. So we see a massive rush of enlistments, and this is something that not an awful lot is made of in Ireland outside of academic writing. So in Ireland, very much, and in Mayo, the folklore, the popular history is that Ireland was suppressed by the redcoats. But if you take off the red coat, you find green tunics under many of them. And there's a staggering figure from 1830, which shows that 42.2% of all non-commissioned officers and men throughout the British Army were Irish. So the rank and file were very much composed of Irishmen. And the vast majority of these enlisted to escape abject poverty. They remained in the lower ranks as trumpeters, drummers, all that kind of stuff, and returned to Ireland if they survived disease, which was the main taker of these men, and conflict 20 plus years later, and just returned to poverty, to prison, to debt, all that kind of stuff. The Protestant Anglo-Irish community contributed significantly to the ranks of the higher ranks of the military, and we find Mayo men, all over the colonial world, leading regiments, fighting at Waterloo, all the really big engagements in Jamaica, etc., etc. So we have a considerable number of Irish men traveling with English regiments all over the empire, enforcing British rule. And one of the things I'm trying to do and trying to convince people is that when we're commemorating these soldiers in Ireland, if people wish to commemorate them, if communities wish to commemorate them, that we cannot legitimately and honestly do that unless we put what they were involved in into a much broader context, that we talk about what they did or what they were involved in India, in Ceylon, and in the Caribbean. And that is a debate that has only just begun in Ireland, and it has a very, very long way to go. So we have a shared history with the former colonized nations in the Caribbean and elsewhere. We were both colonized by the same empire, and in that sense, we have a very strong and shared and deep history. But I would argue that history is exceptionally complex and is far from being fully understood. The Ireland was undoubtedly the laboratory for the British Empire project, and the strategies employed in the colonies mirrored those first used in Ireland. And it's interesting when you look at, for example, the brutal suppression of Phelan's rebellion in Grenada, and you look at the hangings, the court-martials, the transportations, the display of decapitated heads as a way to give a message. We see that exact thing being done in Mayo in 1798, following the failed rebellion in Mayo, where initially the Anglo-Irish establishment and the British military were caught by surprise and lost a really famous battle at Castlebar, but the reprisals for that lasted for decades, and it was, you can see that measure of cruelty displayed across several of the rebellions by enslaved people in the Caribbean as well. And of course, the point I want to stress is those making up the regiments doing those things, be it hunting Uva rebels in Ceylon or whatever, a large number of them are sadly from this part of the world. So today there are traces of colonialism and empire all over Ireland, place names, surnames, monuments, etc. When you look at common surnames in Mayo, the most common are Walsh and Burke. Not Irish names; they are names that came across with the Anglo-Normans from Wales and places like that. Names like my own, O'Connor. Our family, we're pretty much vanquished from power in Mayo. Quite early on in this game, But when you look at my immediate ancestors, my grandmother was Walsh, which is a Norman name. I have 2 Burke ancestors, grandparents, both Norman names. I have several ancestors names whose names have Nordic Viking origins. So really, this is a very complex and interesting place that needs a lot of thought and understanding before we make general statements about who we are or who we were. One of the things that I have spent a lot of time on, as a project that I'm very interested in, is understanding the complicity of Anglo-Irish, Mayo Anglo-Irish planters in the erasure of identity and ethnicity in the Caribbean. And I'm just going to put up, I know that time is really scarce, so I'm going to say a few words very quickly about this. So this is Michael Cuff from Fort Hale, Ballinrobe, County Mayo. This is baptism register of St. Elizabeth Parish, January 1825. And you see, I've broken the list into 2 groups of people. The top 5 are free people of colour. The ones marked in yellow are enslaved. Michael Cuff is obviously the common denominator. But if you take this list and you lay it down side by side with Burke's peerage, or any of the other genealogies of these families, you see all the forenames and the surnames mirror the peerage and mirror the family trees and the histories, yet there is no mention of this family in the peerage. There's no mention of this Jamaican family. They are either by accident or design erased from the story. And when you look at it from the perspective of people in Jamaica and you read Andrew Veach Cuff, what does that mean? Where does that come from? We know that 3 of these individuals were relatives of Michael Cuff, but we don't know exactly. I believe at least 2 of them were children. And Michael Cuff Morgan ultimately succeeds to the estate. But Andrew Veach Cuff, the Veach in that comes from Dr. Andrew Veach, who was a doctor in Galway at the beginning of the 19th century. And he marries one of Michael Cuff's sisters. So a significant degree of digging is required to understand that one word Veach before you even get to understand what the names of those individuals were before this Cuff family starts to stamp their ownership and authority on them. So this is another one. This is Michael Garvey, St. Anne Parish, and you can see again this name-changing process going on where these enslaved people are being given Garvey surnames and forenames. And again, you'll find these people in the Garvey family tree. Sorry, you'll find the names as common names. You won't find these people. Now, finally, just to close really quickly, a little bit on critiquing empire and imperialism. I'm a big fan of our President Michael D. Higgins in this context. And recently, he talks about this reluctance or feigned amnesia, as he calls it, around or a disinclination to talk about or engage with this history of colonialism and imperialism, and that we, the Irish people, spend much more time critiquing and celebrating nationalism. And he's absolutely right, but he's right in this context. We have this Irish Free State emerging in 1921. And of course, what do? Well, we do what every country does. We spend as much time as we can celebrating this and commemorating this, et cetera, and we've really been at this, fairly extensively in the last 12 months. And we should do this. We need to do this, and it's absolutely right. But I've been arguing that we now need to move on a little bit and start looking at a much broader story. And and there is plenty of signals that is happening, and that the UCL legacies of British slave ownership, when that went live around 2013, you see these stories coming back into Ireland, into the newspapers, etc., of Irish people being involved in slavery, and people are genuinely shocked and surprised, and there is a degree of interest in it, and people are finding it very difficult to reconcile that with this notion that we were an oppressed nation of people. Trinity College Dublin has started to look at its connections with the slave trade and empire, and I've just put a link up there to their page. That's quite an interesting project. National Museum of Ireland, they're looking at the issue of colonial plunder. So if you think about it, the new museum is an old institution, and it is full of, I don't know what the number is, but it's a significant number of artifacts taken by British soldiers, by colonial administrators whose origins were not brought back with them to Ireland, and they ultimately make their way into the National Museum through family collections being handed over, etc. So the National Museum is looking at that. Hunt Museum in Limerick is looking at returning costumes, a costume to Africa, and there's some debate around that as well. And then finally, a conversation has begun on the legacy of Irish nationalist and racist John Mitchell. And it's interesting, you know, for example, in Ireland, that John Mitchell, you know, is a revered nationalist, but he also has a dark history with his support for slavery in the United States many years and decades after slavery was abolished elsewhere in the world. But we have, for example, football stadiums that are called after, and football clubs that are called after this man. So thank you so much for the opportunity and for listening to me. More than happy to try and answer any questions you might have. The book it's hardback. It's approximately 555 pages. There are plenty of maps and photographs. For those of you outside of Ireland, I've put up 2 of the platforms you can purchase the book on. So Mayo Books and McLaughlin's Books. You can purchase it online. I would say you should shop around with the various online providers, because there is differences in the cost of postage. The cost of the book itself is 25 €25. So thank you very much.
Wow, well, thank you very much indeed. I can see Vivian Crawford from Jamaica clapping, and what an absolutely excellent presentation. What a really, really significant research. And thank you for preparing a presentation that I think has perhaps helped many of us to really be able to look into this. Absolutely fantastic. So if you'd like to stop, people are making a note of this, and I'll make sure this information also goes out in the PowerPoint and is kept on the website so that people will have access to that. And so if we can maybe take some questions now. I can't see everybody at the moment. So Vivian?
Yes, oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Liz, to hear this presentation. And I beg Dr. O'Connor, when is he arriving in Jamaica? He must come. You must come.
I have been to Jamaica. So
you have been. Where have you been?
I've been up in the north. All of the touristy stuff, but I did manage to about a decade ago. I did manage to steal some time away and visit some of the history as well.
Yeah, I know time is short, but I hasten to ask: is the Mayo Clinic in the United States any link with Ireland?
I don't know.
Because that name is the first time hearing it, and I asked the question because a Jamaican professor was head of that clinic at one time. Okay. I asked that, but it is just incredible. I am so overcome, and I now know why the entrepreneurship system collapsed in Jamaica under Peter Brown, the Marquis of Sligo, because the plantation owners said he was too kind to the enslaved, and I didn't realize that he was Irish in his DNA. Oh my God. Kindred spirits. Thank you very, 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 very much. Wow.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Vivian, for that. Now, Bernard Janke, unfortunately, has had to leave for another meeting, but he said that he found that the presentation was fascinating. This is on the chat. And it held him spellbound and opens up information on areas that I've had an interest in for a long time. Very, very many thanks. That's really great. And Dr. Bunmi Oyinsan, who's joining us from Canada, she produces regular slots on Sankova Pan-African platform on different aspects of Black history. She says thank you very much, and she says she's sorry she has to leave, but that was just so good, and really interesting intervention, Bernard Janke said there. So yeah, fascinating to get that response. And Anne-Marie, what's your comment?
Right, well, my comment is that I actually have an ancestor who was Irish and who was from Barbados, lived in Barbados. Now, the exact date and the first name, I have no idea, because it's my sister who has been looking at the family tree. But I was amazed to find out that that the Irish actually went over to Barbados, or even came over to the Caribbean. I really didn't realize that. I mean, I knew the Scots had, because the family name on my father's side is Walker. Okay, but I didn't realize that the Irish were there as well. So I really do need to have a look at some of these links that Michael has put there, to see if I can get some more detailed information about this.
I'm also really happy. I am currently helping a couple of people who have ancestry in Jamaica and who are now in London. I'm helping them with to tie down family connections, etc. I think what I have found keen interest in genealogy, so I have a good understanding and access to genealogical resources. What I am finding with a lot of people who have connections to Ireland, between Ireland and the Caribbean, is that you're in one of two places. Either you've got a name and there's nothing, and it's quite easy to establish that nothing very quickly, or there's actually a lot there. And so we have found for one individual in particular that over the last, I suppose, number of months, we've entirely rewritten his Jamaican history as a consequence of discussions we've had around connections in Mayo and in Ireland more generally.
Right.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. David Alston's got a point he wants to raise. Thank you, David.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. That's fascinating. I think there are lots of parallels, but also very important differences with the history of Scotland and its involvement in the Caribbean. I wanted to ask you about you've identified the plantation owners and slaveholders from Mayo. And I'm wondering about who they were finding to be the bookkeepers, the overseers, the plantation managers, and also the tradespeople on the estates, the carpenters. Are they drawing people from Mayo to fill these roles as well?
I think it's all and sundries. So I would imagine, David, it's, if you look at, as you have, Scotland, you see that, the agents, there are lawyers and accountants, etc. And you see amongst the names that are very familiar in Mayo. And so, for example, you see how Peter Brown brings out his cousin Patrick Brown at one stage as a kind of an estate manager. But you also find strong connections between the west of Ireland, Bristol and Liverpool, and London to a lesser extent. So you see that the slave owners that have their origins in Mayo are using and partnering with individuals who are based in, and merchants and financiers who are based in London, Bristol and Liverpool. So you see that dynamic, the proximity to London and the strong connections between these people, albeit they're in a remote part of Ireland. They're in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So you're seeing that, and so you are seeing people going from the west of Ireland. I would say I would be very reluctant to put a measure on the numbers of individuals, ordinary people, leaving Mayo and going to the Caribbean to do the type of tasks that you've outlined. There definitely are some, I've identified some, but I would be at this stage be very reluctant to say it was a lot or whatever. On the tradespeople side, I think it's the same thing. You see them sharing individuals between estates. Like, it's quite interesting. You have, I find people talk a lot about the Browns as being important. I find the Garveys absolutely fascinating because the duration of their time in Jamaica, like it's from 1700 all the way down to abolition and beyond. And during that time, they're continuously writing to their family in Mayo. So you have them sending daughters to this part of the world for weddings and marriages, taking men back to Jamaica to themselves become involved in planting and enslaving. So there's a very strong family tie there. And of course, Westport House, the Brown House, is just a few minutes drive today from the Garvey house here. So I think there's a degree of sharing of resources, knowledge and information, etc., between these groups that hitherto perhaps hasn't been noticed or seen. Now, at the outside Vivian was asking me about spending time in the Caribbean. There was a planned trip to both Jamaica and Grenada planned as part of this research, but for reasons we all know about, that ended. And rather than spending a year, or not a year, rather than spending 2 months in the Caribbean doing what would have been interesting research, I spent it just writing a version of this book, which probably is a year or two earlier than I probably would have liked. There's more work to be done. But I think, David, what you're asking about maybe comes later.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
That's really interesting and good to hear about that. And one of the things, as I've said before, is that we've tried to get people from all 4 countries and different parts of England to be looking at their immediate story. Gwyneth, you've got a point you wanted to raise.
Yes, just to thank you very much. That was fascinating. And you used an expression, the pale. Is that where we get the expression beyond the pale?
Yeah, beyond the pale was not a place you went in the early decades, centuries of colonization of Ireland, because beyond the pale is where all the wild Irish lived, the uncivilized people. And if you wandered beyond the pale, then you were likely to be at least robbed and possibly worse. So the Pale is this center of administration within, around Dublin. It's fortified, it's protected, and it's from the Pale that to a certain extent, or to a large extent maybe, you see the expansion of colonialism into Ireland.
Mm. Oh, thank you. My husband and I did live in Connemara, in the Connemara for a couple of years in the 70s.
Very good. Another wild and beautiful part of the world.
Absolutely. And this is a general question. Is all of this current interest in slavery, is this a result of the George Floyd incident, or was it happening anyway?
Your question is really, really good. And it's one of the things I have been finding very difficult to deal with, as I think there are two or three other people in Ireland like me. One is Liam Hogan from Limerick. But one of the difficulties I've encountered, I've been interested in the topic of slavery and colonialism since I was a child. I grew up in a house that where history was really important, but significantly from a lot of the houses of my friends, the house I grew up in was interested in world history, not necessarily or exclusively Irish history. So I've had a long interest in this, but I am struggling to get the message across that my interest stems from this long interest and not from bandwagoning, jumping on the bandwagon. And so therefore I'm continuously confronted with this. And what I find very difficult to get across to people is that it is inconsistent to wish to push a narrative of oppressed Irish people and Irish people being killed by the Redcoats to the exclusion of a narrative of people in another part of the world also being oppressed by the Redcoats and not allowing people to draw the comparisons and the parallels. So I would say there is a significant movement against sorry, it's not a significant number of people, but it's very vocal people making these connections between people trying to reveal history and then linking it with just trying to, I suppose, get the benefit of all of the media coverage that's arisen from the George Floyd matter and also from the toppling of some of the statues in Bristol and elsewhere.
Right, that's really very interesting. I think one of the things that fascinated me was way that you talked about the wider Ireland being a laboratory for the British Empire project and the involvement of the Irish in the British Empire, because I don't think we can really be honestly studying Black history unless we understand our own history better and the history of what the British Empire and the other European empires were actually doing. And that really has made me take a different perspective on things. So it's really interesting to have you talk about that. And I think there are other things apart from the Black Lives Matter campaigns that's really bringing this to the fore now. And the other thing is that there's now a lot more accessible information through websites like the UCL website, which I think is exceptional. Okay, Vivian, I'm going to ask you, have you got any other questions, your points that you wanted to raise, or how would you see us moving forward with this?
Well, we would love, 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 love to have Dr. O'Connor speaking to Jamaicans, because Lord Sligo, he was given a massive candelabra by the enslaved for his work, and the first free village in Jamaica is called Sligoville, named after Lord Sligo. Then there were some persons, Jamaicans, living in a place called Boroughbridge, St. Anne. The complexion, I said, how come? Did they come from through the Middle Passage? I now realize that the Codners, that it's the Irish community, and so is Leicesterfield in Clarendon and Brownstown in St. Anne. It is just incredible. Incidentally, Brownstown in St. Anne, that's where the father of Vice President Kamala Harris came from. It's just this presentation this morning is I just can't get over it, and I just want to thank you, Liz. I want to thank you very, very much for this presentation that Dr. O'Connor has given. It is just incredible. I can't believe this. Wow. Thank you.
I think that's
Liz,
just
could I ask
a comment. Yes, Chris, of course.
I'm interested in the reaction in Ireland, Michael, to your work. I mean, I'm sensing that people are excluding these owners from Irish history because they're Anglo-Norman or were families who weren't necessarily committed to the notion of Irish independence from Britain. Is that a strong current in the critiques that people offer of what you're doing?
Not in any of the meaningful critiques, not in any of the critiques that are supported by people who've done research, not by people who write academically in this space. As I said earlier, what I've faced is this insistence that these people were not Irish, notwithstanding that many of them were in Ireland for many hundreds of years. And so the way that I've, I suppose, tackled that is to really, I've stopped using the labels to a large extent and tried to explain where they were, who they were, what they were doing. So to look at it from a very kind of practical perspective, and to stop talking about Protestants and Catholics and that kind of stuff, and just to tell the lives of these people and put them in places at times, and expose their writings and the writings in public versus the stuff that they were. Like, for example, one of the great things that's been revealed, and I've included a lot of it in the book, is they have they had a public persona at the time, and we see this with people like Lord Sligo. But then they were writing to Dublin Castle. And then you get the different persona, and so you can get a much more complete picture of these people from this, I suppose, greater depth of research into the different sources, rather than just writing a letter, reading a letter that they've written to somebody that's in the public domain. So they write it with public domain awareness in mind, so they're careful what they say. But when they're writing to Dublin Castle, it's, we need guns, we need to put this lot down, we need, you can see this anti-Catholic, anti-peasant, horrible stuff in these letters. So I would, yes, there is absolutely the narrative that you're talking about, but the vast majority of people are silent on the issue. And I think silence to a certain extent tells its own story, because you can guess, that perhaps people aren't so comfortable about it. But the most vocal people is a very small group of people who use social media to undermine research, to perpetuate myths, and push narratives that are linked to their own uninformed agendas.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Thanks for that point, Chris, as well. Okay, Gwyneth, it's good that you were able to be with us, and I know you need to get on your way. One of the things I wanted to come back to you on, Vivian, was that you've been good enough to join in on a number of these Black History conversations. And I think we now have a wealth, really, of presenters who are all able to tell aspects of the stories that may well be of great interest to your academic colleagues and yourselves and other people in Jamaica. So might it be possible that we could do a joint conference event at a good Jamaican time? I'm not talking about...
Sure.
And then maybe, Michael, it might be possible perhaps to invite you, to invite David.
Yes.
Speakers. We can create something, decide, how we want to run that, so that that would be another way of sharing this information, because I'm just stunned by the session today. I really thank you so much, because there was so much that I certainly didn't understand. So Vivian, do you think that would be possible?
I think it would be possible, Liz, and I'm so glad you asked the question, because my continuing regret is that our generation were brutal to one another for the actions of our ancestors without even realizing that we were not there. What we are trying to do now is to make planet Earth a better place than we found it. But sometimes we can be very unkind. We have to pay for the sins of our ancestors. And forgiveness is so strong. It is such a tonic that we need to embrace that. So any actions, any presentations, any involvement to make us realize that we are brothers and sisters, wow, we embrace your suggestion, Liz. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I'm all for helping out as well. So just let us know what's planned, and we'll participate.
Thank you very much. One thing I rarely mention, so you clap in there, Vivian, is this is an unfunded activity. We have no mainstream funding behind this, but that makes it kind of possible to explore, as we want to explore with friends, people who are our friends. And it's great to have had two of my good friends from Jamaica with us today. Professor Sir Jeff Palmer, who is also a friend of ours and has supported our actions. One of his sayings is, and it's really important, that we can understand about the past, but we can't do anything about what happened in the past, but we can do something about the consequences. And I think it would be great to be able to have Sir Jeff, showcase and explain the work that he's done as a Jamaican in Scotland. Wow. To campaign, and that would be really great. So I could see us really expanding in that way. So thank you so much, Vivian, for your contribution in that.
We're going to send some virtual rum to you all.
We'll be virtually drunk for Christmas.
And some jerk chicken, Jerk chicken,
yeah.
Okay, that's great. So Christine White from Glasgow University, she says, thanks so much, Michael, and for organising it. Now, I really happy to present a joint event. That would be wonderful. So I think we might get some of our university colleagues over here as well. If it's okay, Michael, thank you so much again. Absolutely fantastic. We carry on with the discussions, but we just need to begin to wrap things up now. And
can I come in?
is there anything you want to come in with? Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to ask Dr. O'Connor, are you looking for evidence? You say you're interested in genealogy. Are you finding any baptisms and genealogical evidence of African people or people of African and Indian descent in Ireland, in County Mayo? Because that's an area, you know, I'm interested in people from Africa and Asia who came to Britain from 1500 to 1950, all over the British Isles, and obviously that includes every bit of Ireland. And I've only found William Hart. I don't know what his professor or Dr. William Hart, Bill Hart. But is there anybody in Ireland that's looking for that kind of evidence?
So there's a lady based in County Kerry who's running an enormous project, and her project is to identify Irish slave owners in the Southern American states. Now, I know that's not what your question asked about, but she is looking at some of these individuals because they would have come up from the Caribbean. And so she's working with their, with record sets that may include what you're looking for. It's from a perspective of records in Ireland, I think there's very little in terms of what you're looking for. There is an academic at the University of Coleraine, whose name escapes me just now, and he has published a paper where he has identified occurrences of people of color in Mayo before 1800. There are very few of them, but I've seen a map with the with the number of dots showing where these people were, and in my mind I'm aligning some of them with the country houses of Mayo. So I do have a plan to get hold of him and try and get the, fortunately he doesn't give enough detail of his sources, and get him to tell me who he has in mind. But I would say that looking in Mayo, possibly Ireland, excluding maybe Dublin, for birth certificates, I think probably it wouldn't be the first place I would go. You could spend a lot of time with very little reward.
Mm.
Thank you, that's very interesting. And Audrey, I know how interested you are in this field and the work that you've done, the article that you've done, which I'm going to show again on the PowerPoint, about the Black presence in Wales, the early Black presence in Wales. Absolutely remarkable, absolutely remarkable. So that's great. Okay, any other?
I sincerely think there'll be more evidence in Ireland than you expect if you look for it. That's the thing, people don't think to look, so they don't find it. But I mean, another thing one last thing, on the Battle of the Boyne, have you come across the 200 Africans that came over with King Billy?
No, I haven't, but what I have come across is references in Irish writings of the time of Black soldiers in the regiments. So there undoubtedly were some in Ireland, but I've seen no records of what you mentioned.
Well, because I'm really keen to find out about that, but also that those Black soldiers in the regiments, they were often the musicians and the drummers and whatnot, and they were the ones who were made to do the flogging. I've seen pictures of them flogging Irish people, and I think, you know, just one of these awful things in history.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry about that. It's just that I'm trying to find out about Black people and Asian people in Ireland.
No, and I mean, one of the things I wanted to float earlier, and I completely forgot about, I'll just mention briefly. My research is very, very narrow. So I'm looking at County Mayo. I'm looking at, 1670 up to 1834. So it's quite a narrow pool of, I suppose, planted slavers I'm looking at. What I have not yet looked at, and what I found no evidence to the extent that I have been looking, is any involvement by people from County Mayo with the the trade of enslaved people out of Africa into the Caribbean or indeed anywhere else. Now we know that there were Irish people involved in that, Antoine Walsh of Limerick being probably the most well known, but I've not seen any Mayo side to that. But I would be very surprised if there wasn't, because you had a lot of Irish people, a lot of people from Mayo in France, Spain, countries like that, who of course have their own history of enslavement in the Caribbean. So I think that's a whole new world that obviously not having the requisite language skills, I don't see myself getting into, but it's there to be explored.
That's fantastic. Chris, you'd got a point you wanted to make. Chris, we can't hear.
Sorry. Taking that point on board, Michael, that you've got a very, very detailed and fascinating focus on Mayo. I mean, what about the Waterford area in terms of the potential for its involvement in the slave trade, in the trading of Africans?
I think Waterford, I think Cork, I think Limerick, Galway, Dublin and Belfast are all places that should be looked at from the trade perspective. And I think there is undoubtedly potential there for to reveal histories that we're not aware of.
Right. Okay. So that's more to do. I think it's wonderful that actually that you focus so closely on one county. When we're talking about how we're going to help to share the stories of Black history, we're talking about a model which is on a county by county basis, because a county is a big enough area but a small enough area for people to relate to, and I think that may well work. So that's one of our ideas and thoughts. So thank you very much for that now. Michael, are you okay staying on a little longer with us?
I'll stay for a few more minutes, no problem, yeah.
Okay, can you unshare your screen then, please?
Doing that now.
Thank you.
Very good.
All right, and then, all right, I'm just going to share my screen so it can carry on with where we're at. Okay, so a little bit of sorry about that. What have I done? Right, here we go. So a little bit more there. Just to say that next week we're going to have a special session, perhaps a little longer than we normally do, because we've invited the Jamaican High Commissioner to join us as well. And possibly our guests from Jamaica. We'd be absolutely delighted if you could join us. I wondered if Vereen Shepherd might be able to as well. We'll see. She's just got back from her stint over in Geneva, I think. So next week, Alex Renton's going to make a presentation about his book, Blood Legacy. Now, I've had an opportunity to read that. I'm sorry, Michael, it wasn't possible to get a copy of your book here to me in time. But his book is fascinating and refers specifically to Jamaica connections his family had there with plantation ownership, and Tobago. So David Alston and other guests will be talking about our exploration into ways of developing reparation projects, and that's something that I'm involved in too. So that's next week. So this is Alex Renton and a little bit of information there. And this is Jeff Palmer's quote: "You can't change the history, but you can still change its consequences." And there are links there for the book and articles. So then, Black History Resources. Okay. So this is something that Audrey sent me. Thank you very much indeed, Audrey. We talked last week about celebrating Barbados's new Republican status. This is an absolutely fascinating podcast. and I haven't managed to listen to it all the way through, but I'll do that at some stage. But that's excellent. And so on a slide like this, it isn't the thing that you'd press if you get to the website, go through, and I've actually made the links active. I can't demonstrate to you now, but then you would find a page that looks like that, the Guardian page, and that's the thing you click on, and then you can listen to it. There are some fabulous podcasts now. Now, this was Discovering Black History in Wales. This was Audrey Judy's wonderful article, absolutely fantastic, and so much information. I think you'd find that really interesting, Michael, to see just how many stories of Black presence there is in Wales at a certain time, and I'm sure that it would have been replicated with the Anglo-Norman landowners of Ireland. Another fantastic podcast. I don't know if anybody managed to listen to this, but we have some really good radio here in Australia, really good radio, ABC. And this was fascinating to hear this presentation about the Caribbean convicts who came to Australia and their history. And the ancestors are one of my Rotary friends over here. This is another very interesting interview that the previous one was a podcast, which is sort of almost like acted out, but it's really good with the sound effects and all sorts. But this one was a straightforward interview. There's this lovely guy called Philip Adams who does interviews with all kinds of interesting people from all sorts of different backgrounds on what he calls his little wireless show. And Born in Blackness is a book that has been written by an American academic, Howard French, which is absolutely fascinating. And the way that it's an hour-long interview, and Philip Adams is really good at getting people to tell the story and summary of work that they're doing. So absolutely fantastic, and a really good review in the New York Times about that one. And that comes from a very African perspective. And what they're saying is that along with this 1619 project, which is a very, very significant step along the road of telling the story of Black history in America, in the US, that book that I mentioned previously is of equitable significance, some people are saying in the reviews, which is interesting. So the New York Times produced a special edition, New York Times Magazine, a special magazine which was called the 1619 Project, and had to reprint a number of times. Well, it's now come out as a book, and it's a really profoundly revealing vision of America past and present. It's absolutely fascinating. So no doubt that'll get into the libraries presently, or some of you might be able to purchase that. This is just, and I can't find where this reference came from, but I'm very interested in the Paul Robeson story because he has a real connection with the some of the issues and concerns in South Wales. So I'll come back to you on that when I've found the rest out. And this is another interesting link again. I've managed to get online History Today. So apparently in this volume, there's a very interesting piece about Toussaint Louverture. All right, this is Gresham College, who do the most brilliant lectures. This is a lecture by Robin Walker. Robin Walker's book on Black history was one of the absolute classics back in the day a few years ago when a number of us were starting to look at these issues. And this is about the manuscripts and the intellectual legacy of Timbuktu. It's an absolutely fascinating presentation that he's giving with his slides. At Gresham College, invite luminary people. Just thinking about you, Michael, would be good to do a talk for them, because then they archive very well, and then these resources are available for scholars in the future and people doing community research. I managed to listen to this at some unearthly hour of the morning. The Indentured Remembered. This was interesting. Again, a different style of presentation, because the 3 short monologues are presented very interestingly, blending the first person testimonies together by a team of actors and writers and directors. It's very good. And again, you go through the link, the big link at the bottom, and then you'll find a page that looks like this, and that's the page you click onto. Don't forget that the National Trust published that report. I know it's of interest to England and Wales. I don't know if there's anything similar going on in Ireland, but this came out quite some time ago, and my word, it's caused some controversy, including linking historic slavery details with 93 historic places. Well, I've included this again, and it's a really long and interesting report, because at last, after a very long time, I'm proud to say that the North Wales Jamaica Society are going to have a meeting with Penryn Castle's National Trust team. So that's a step in the right direction. We're getting a programme sorted out for season 5, and we hope, I think Laura T. Murphy is going to be one of the presenters for us. And this is a modern story of a 21st century slave revolt. So we need to be seeing things in perspective. So this is going to be a very interesting one. So I wanted to remind us about that and give you some further information about what that's going to be about. So if anybody can get hold of the copy of the book, and it'll be good to talk to her. So thank you. Please send me links and suggestions for any areas of research. Thank you very much indeed to Audrey. DJ, thank you so much, because I do appreciate it when these emails pop up and then it gives me something exciting and interesting to look at. But I'm often looking at a number of other things as well. Okay then, so just checking the chats. I don't know if there's any questions about any of those. Chris?
I'm going to have to leave now, but a wonderful session. Thank you so much. Just fantastic.
Well, thank you so much. All right. Well, I think we'll just wrap up the recording now, and then we can chat a little afterwards. Okay. So, Simon, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just quickly before you stop, also to remind that we've booked in David Viner, who's going to talk about Major Taylor, the Black American cyclist champion from the late 19th, early 20th century, February.
That's excellent then. So we're really getting an interesting program going. So that's really good. So well, we thank you again, Michael, and thank you for everybody who joined us this time. So we'll wrap this session up now. Thank you, Simon.